We all know that holidays and festivals are times for celebration, feasts, and family gatherings. But imagine a 7-day festival where missing one speck of leaven, the size of a crumb, could break a sacred law. Or a purification ritual where cleaning someone else makes you dirty. The ancient world was full of such radical, fascinating rules. In today's video, we'll talk about the weirdest ancient biblical festivals and the extreme rules that governed daily life and ritual. So let's not waste any time and let's begin. Tonight, we're beginning our quiet descent into the truly ancient world of biblical festivals. A world where the act of celebrating was often deeply uncomfortable and required the most meticulous, almost absurd attention to detail. We start with Passover, and specifically the 7-day holiday immediately following it, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Hag Hamatzot. Now, if you think preparing for a modern holiday involves too much effort, the frantic grocery runs, the deep cleaning, the coordinating of seating charts, imagine transforming your entire house into a spiritual battlefield against a single, common baking ingredient: yeast. The law commanded that for 7 days, no leavened product, known as chametz, could be found, seen, or consumed within an Israelite's dwelling. This wasn't just a dietary restriction. It was a spiritual mandate that turned the simple act of spring cleaning into a religious obsession. Think of chametz as anything made from grain that had been allowed to rise: bread, cake, even certain beers, representing the puffiness of pride, or the rushed, unfinished nature of the slavery they were remembering. So, before the festival began, every piece of furniture, every crack in the floor, and every kitchen utensil had to be searched. This was known as Bedikat Chametz, the searching for leaven, and it was a ritual that required absolute paranoid diligence. People would often search by the light of a candle, using a feather to sweep up crumbs into a wooden spoon. This highly specific, quiet search wasn't merely about hygiene. It was about ensuring spiritual purity through a complete physical removal of sin's metaphor. Imagine the silence in the home, broken only by the gentle rustling of the feather, the anxious flickering of the candle, and the very real fear of missing a crumb the size of an olive pit. Everything had to be meticulously checked: pockets, pantries, children's toys, even between the floorboards. Any chametz found, even if it was just a tiny forgotten piece of bread crust, had to be gathered up and formally sold, or, more dramatically, ritually burned the next morning in a public bonfire. The sheer intensity of this process, the deep, quiet scrubbing, the systematic searching of every crevice, was designed to be an annual reset for the soul, preparing the participants for the week ahead. It's hard to imagine that level of intense, mandated, annual house cleaning, especially in an era without vacuum cleaners and readily available cleaning supplies. Even after the thorough search, there was a symbolic act, a formal verbal declaration renouncing ownership of any remaining leaven that might have been missed, a cosmic liability waiver. For the subsequent 7 days, the people were required to consume only matzah, a thin, cracker-like bread that had no time to rise. This bread symbolized the haste with which their ancestors fled Egypt. They had to leave so quickly, they didn't even have time to let their dough ferment. The mandated eating of matzah wasn't just a practical meal. It was a physical, daily act of remembering a foundational historical trauma. Every single bite was meant to be a moment of active recollection, connecting the person in their clean, leaven-free home directly to the desperate, freed slave walking through the desert. The dual nature of the festival is fascinating. First, the utter, destructive removal of one kind of bread, and then the mandatory, strict consumption of another. This week was one of the three Shalosh Regalim, or pilgrimage festivals, meaning every male Israelite who was physically able was commanded to travel to the temple in Jerusalem. Think of the roads, packed with families and animals, all converging on one sacred city, all carrying 7 days' worth of unleavened food. This confluence of people and piety only added to the festive, yet highly regulated atmosphere of Jerusalem during this week. The communal aspect reinforced the personal. The shared act of eating only matzah created a powerful bond, a unifying physical experience of humility and haste. They were all collectively remembering a painful but liberating origin story through the discomfort of restrictive dining. The meticulous preparation required by this festival set the tone for the entire sacred calendar, demanding exactitude and a deep, literal engagement with the past. The physical action of removing and restricting was a prerequisite for the spiritual growth to come. This period of physical cleansing and dietary restraint immediately preceded the moment when the year's agricultural success was first placed in the hands of the divine. You see, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was less about the bread and more about clearing the slate. The meticulous removal of the old paved the way for the celebration of the new harvest. And with the first day of the festival completed, the Israelites were ready to begin an ancient, time-based countdown that literally defined their future wealth. That complex countdown, focusing on the first tiny signs of life in the field, is where we drift next, leading us directly into the mystery of the first required offering of the season. As the deep stillness of the unleavened week begins to settle over the ancient world, we turn our attention from the frantic search of the home to the patient, quiet expectation of the field. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was about remembrance and purification, but immediately following it, the focus shifted entirely to the future, specifically to the destiny of the young barley crop. This transition was marked by a seemingly simple, yet deeply consequential ritual: the presentation of the first sheaf, or the omer. Imagine the fields just outside Jerusalem in the early spring, still crisp from the last vestiges of winter. The barley is the first grain to ripen, its heads heavy and almost ready for harvest. But no one was permitted to touch a single stalk or use any of the new grain until this small, precise ceremony was completed. It was a moment of profound agricultural anxiety because the success of the entire year hung on the ritual acceptance of this tiny portion. The timing was precise and often debated, but it always took place on the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Just as the sun was beginning to lift over the eastern hills, a designated priest, accompanied by a small, solemn procession, would go out to the field. He carried with him the tools for a very specific ritualistic harvest. This was not a general reaping. It was an act of sacred distinction. With meticulous care, the priest would harvest just enough barley to make one omer, a specific measure of grain, which was roughly 2 quarts. This small sheaf was then brought into the temple courtyard. There, it was threshed, winnowed, and roasted in the heat of the morning. It was then ground into fine flour and presented to God as a wave offering, waved by the priest in the 4 cardinal directions, signifying God's dominion over the entire world and the whole harvest. The acceptance of this omer offering by the priest and, symbolically, by the divine presence in the temple, acted as a spiritual go-ahead signal for the entire nation. It was the divine green light that permitted the rest of the barley harvest to begin. Until that moment, the entire crop, essential for survival, was effectively locked away, untouchable. This ritual highlights the ancient understanding that human effort alone was insufficient. The success of their daily bread required celestial cooperation. But the presentation of the barley sheaf did more than just open the harvest. It started a clock. This single day marked the beginning of a 50-day countdown, known as the counting of the Omer. Every single night, for the next 7 weeks, the people were commanded to audibly count the day and the week that had passed. Today is 1 day of the Omer, then 2, then 3, then 7 days, which is 1 week. This ritualized counting added a steady, measured rhythm to the spring season. This quiet, daily counting was an intentional act of focusing the mind on the passage of time and the anticipated arrival of the next great festival. It linked the historical liberation of Passover with the coming celebration of the harvest. It infused the mundane routine of weeks with spiritual purpose, keeping the populace focused on a future destination. The countdown was a spiritual staircase, leading the nation from the haste of slavery to the stability of the promised land's bounty. The agricultural symbolism here is profound. Barley, the first crop, was considered the food of animals and the poor, representing the most basic, fundamental layer of sustenance. They started the count with the most humble offering, a testament to their dependence on God for even the simplest grains. The ritual was performed early in the morning, often before dawn fully broke, lending it an air of mystery and silent dedication. Imagine the field bathed in the cool, pre-dawn light, the whispers of the priests, the swish of the sickle, all dedicated to the blessing of the future crop. The counting ritual was a quiet acknowledgement of the fragility of life and the volatility of the natural world. They counted not just days, but the anticipation of a life-sustaining gift. It was a sustained exercise in patience, linking one major holy day to another with a thread of meditative observance. This methodical, deliberate marking of time taught the entire community the value of small, daily steps toward a great culmination. Each day of counting brought them closer to the grand finale, the final day of the Omer. This endpoint, the 50th day, was not just an arbitrary calendar mark. It was the date of the next major festival, a holiday known for celebrating the much richer, more luxurious wheat harvest. The humble barley offering, having started the entire process, yielded its place to a celebration defined by the pinnacle of ancient agriculture. The counting stops when the wheat is finally ripe, ready to be celebrated with an entirely different kind of bread offering. That final, significant step in the harvest cycle, the festival known as Shavuot, is where our quiet journey takes us next. The 50 days of the Omer counting have now concluded, bringing us to the conclusion of the spring cycle and the arrival of the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot. If Passover was about liberation and the Omer was about patient waiting, Shavuot was about culmination and commitment. In the agricultural sense, it was the final, joyous celebration of the completed spring grain harvest, marked by the arrival of the wheat. In the spiritual sense, it became the moment to remember the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, perfectly connecting the bounty of the earth with the gift of divine law. This festival was considered one of the 3 great pilgrimage festivals, meaning the roads to Jerusalem would again be crowded with pilgrims bringing their first and finest produce to the temple. But the most unique and perhaps most contradictory ritual of Shavuot centered on a pair of loaves of bread. After weeks of rigorously purging their homes of all leaven, and after 50 days of eating the simple, unrisen matzah, the Israelites were commanded to bring an offering that was decidedly and deliberately leavened. This offering consisted of 2 loaves of wheat bread baked with yeast, known as the shtei halachem. This deliberate introduction of leavened bread back into the temple and into the spiritual calendar carried profound symbolism. It acknowledged the transition from the temporary, hurried state of the Exodus, symbolized by the flat, hasty matzah, to the permanent, settled, and imperfect state of everyday life in the Promised Land. The rising of the bread represented the fullness and complexity of a settled existence, an existence that included both blessing and sin. The 2 leavened loaves were the only grain offering of the entire year that contained yeast, making them an anomaly, a required breach of an otherwise strict rule. They symbolized a sense of completeness, representing the 2 foundational aspects of their relationship with God, the giving of the law and the sustenance of the harvest. Think of the visual contrast. Just weeks earlier, every crumb of yeast was being scraped from the floorboards, and now here stood 2 perfectly puffed, golden loaves presented with honor. The dual significance of Shavuot, the wheat harvest and the giving of the Torah, created a deep, multi-layered celebration. The people would bring their first fruits, the bikurim, arranged in elaborate baskets woven with flowers and ribbons. The journey to the temple became a sensory experience of abundance and gratitude, with singers and flutes accompanying the processions. The focus shifted from the anxieties of planting to the realization of the bounty. This act of offering the first fruits was accompanied by a heartfelt declaration, a spoken history summarizing the journey from slavery in Egypt to the prosperity of the present moment. This ritual ensured that the joy of the harvest was always grounded in the memory of hardship, a reminder that their current blessing was part of a grander historical narrative. The declaration required the person to acknowledge that the land they stood on was a direct fulfillment of God's oath to their ancestors. The commitment on Shavuot was one of dedication, dedicating the first fruits of the field and dedicating the entire nation to the ongoing study and implementation of the Torah. The act of receiving the law was seen as a renewal of the covenant, an annual recommitment to the principles that defined their society. This day of abundance and commitment stood in stark contrast to the period we are about to explore, a period marked by scarcity and profound self-affliction. The joyous celebration of the 2 leavened loaves, signifying the acceptance of a full, imperfect life was followed by a lengthy period of summer and early fall, leading to the high holy days. As the calendar turned, the tone would shift dramatically from the loud joy of the harvest to an intimidating, mandatory silence. This quiet, measured celebration of the harvest set the stage for the most solemn day of the year, a day that demanded the complete physical cessation of all human comforts. This move from joyous consumption to absolute self-denial brings us to the Day of Atonement, the day when the entire nation held its breath. The celebratory season of the harvest has now passed, giving way to the autumn and the single most critical, intense, and austere day in the entire biblical calendar, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. If the other festivals were about communal feasting or pilgrimage, this day was defined by the mandatory cessation of almost all human activity and comfort. It was a day of profound, total self-denial. The primary requirement of Yom Kippur was the 25-hour fast, a commandment to afflict your souls. This meant not only abstaining from all food and water, but also from washing, anointing oneself with oils, wearing leather shoes, and engaging in any kind of intimate activity. The purpose was to strip away all the physical distractions and comforts of the world, leaving the individual in a state of raw, humble emptiness. Imagine the quiet stillness that would fall over the entire nation for this full day and night. This state of personal emptiness was deemed necessary for communal cleansing. The fasting was not merely penance, it was preparation. By minimizing the self, the individual could focus entirely on introspection, repentance, and the great spiritual work being performed on their behalf in the temple. It was a day when the nation's spiritual fate was decided, and everyone, from the most powerful elder to the humblest laborer, participated in the same universal vulnerability. While the nation fasted, all spiritual attention was focused on one figure, the high priest. The laws governing the high priest's movements on Yom Kippur were the most intricate and terrifying of the year. He had to perform a meticulous, day-long series of rituals, often changing clothes multiple times, from his elaborate gold-adorned garments to simple, plain white linen, which symbolized purity and humility. The climax of his service was his singular entrance into the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of the tabernacle and later the temple, where the Ark of the Covenant rested and the divine presence was believed to dwell most intensely. This room was normally empty and utterly inaccessible. The high priest was permitted to enter only on this one day, only after elaborate purification, and only to present the sacrificial blood. The danger was immense. The laws were so specific that any misstep, any lapse in purity or procedure could result in his instant death. He entered the Holy of Holies alone, carrying burning incense so that the room would be filled with a cloud of smoke, protecting him from gazing directly upon the divine presence. This act of solitary intercession on behalf of the entire nation carried the weight of the world. He performed the ritual of sprinkling the blood upon and before the mercy seat of the ark, symbolizing the atonement for the sins of the priests, the people, and the sanctuary itself. Think of the sheer psychological pressure on this one man, knowing that the spiritual life of his entire community rested on his every measured step and precise action. While he was inside the sanctuary, the entire populace waited outside in absolute prayerful silence, holding their breath until he emerged. The fast itself became a shared experience of humility and dependence. They were reminded that, stripped of daily sustenance and comfort, they were utterly reliant on a source greater than themselves. It was a yearly recalibration of priorities, a forceful interruption of routine designed to remind them of their mortality and their moral duty. The meticulous nature of the high priest's movements was mirrored by the stillness and introspection of the common person. Once the high priest emerged safely, the tension broke and the moment of communal atonement was achieved. But his work was not yet finished. Having performed the most sacred internal rite, he then had to turn his attention to the most theatrical and terrifying external ritual of the day, a ceremony designed to visually and physically remove the entire weight of the nation's guilt. The cleansing of the sanctuary within now had to be matched by the expulsion of sin outside. This highly visual, dramatic expulsion, involving a selection by lot and a long, lonely journey into the wilderness, is the powerful scene that awaits us next. The Day of Atonement, having begun with the silent vulnerability of the national fast and continued with the intense, solitary work of the high priest within the Holy of Holies, now moves into its dramatic external phase. This was the ritual of the two goats, perhaps the most theatrical and deeply unsettling ceremony of the entire biblical calendar, designed to physically transfer and then remove the nation's accumulated guilt. Before the high priest entered the sanctuary, two identical goats were brought forward and presented at the entrance of the tabernacle. These two goats represented the entire community and were placed at the mercy of chance. A lot was cast over them. One lot was marked for the Lord, and the other was marked for Azazel, a name associated with the wilderness, and often understood to mean complete removal or total dismissal. The fate of the two goats would then diverge completely. The goat upon which the lot for the Lord fell was sacrificed as a sin offering. Its blood was carried by the high priest into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the people, concluding the internal phase of the ritual we explored previously. This goat paid the price, representing the expiation of sin through sacrificial death. But the second goat, the one designated for Azazel, remained alive. This goat became the central living symbol of the day's drama. After completing the rites inside the sanctuary, the high priest would return, lay his hands upon the head of the living goat, and verbally confess over it all the sins, transgressions, and iniquities of the entire people of Israel. Every moral failing, every hidden deceit, every communal error was symbolically loaded onto the head of this single animal. Imagine the powerful weight of that moment, the most sanctified person in the nation, transferring the full spiritual burden of the community onto a mute, bewildered beast. Once the confession was complete, the goat was no longer an ordinary animal. It was the carrier of the nation's entire spiritual debt. To ensure the sins were permanently removed, this goat could not be allowed to wander back into the community. The goat was then entrusted to a specially appointed man, often referred to as a fit man, who had the task of leading the goat away. This journey was not a simple stroll outside the city gates. The goat had to be taken far into the unforgiving, desolate wilderness, to a place from which it could never return. Tradition suggests the goat was led to a steep cliff or precipice far from human habitation and pushed over, ensuring its complete and final destruction. The man who led the goat, having made physical contact with the collective sin of the nation, was considered temporarily defiled and had to perform his own cleansing rituals before returning to the camp. The symbolism was crystal clear. The sin was not merely forgiven or absorbed. It was physically and unequivocally removed from the presence of the people, banished into the nothingness of the desert, where it ceased to exist for the community. Ancient sources tell us that a scarlet thread was often tied to the horns of the scapegoat, and sometimes another was tied to the temple entrance. It was believed that if the people's atonement was accepted, the scarlet thread would miraculously turn white as the goat disappeared into the distance, a deeply dramatic sign of divine pardon. The entire ritual offered a powerful, visual, and unforgettable reassurance that the communal slate had been wiped clean. This act of forcefully taking the nation's problems outside the protective boundaries of the camp and abandoning them in the wilderness provides a perfect conceptual segue to our next festival. The scapegoat was driven out so that the people could return to their homes purified. But the next great festival would command the people to willingly, joyously, and temporarily leave those purified homes altogether and dwell in the wilderness themselves. That festival, requiring everyone to build and live in fragile, temporary structures, is where we drift next, as we turn our attention to the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot, having concluded the solemn, purifying work of Yom Kippur, where all was quieted and the nation's sins were cast away. The calendar takes an immediate, joyous turn towards chaos and temporary discomfort. Just 4 days after the intense fasting and austerity of the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot, began. This was the third and final great pilgrimage festival of the year, a celebration defined not by what was brought into the home, but by what was willingly left behind. The central, deeply strange requirement of Sukkot was simple. For 7 days, every Israelite was commanded to leave their permanent dwelling, their stable house, their warm bed, their solid roof, and live in a temporary hut, a sukkah. This was a physical, direct, annual reenactment of their ancestors wandering through the desert for 40 years after the Exodus. They were commanded to remember the fragility of that time, when they had no fixed address and relied entirely on divine provision. Imagine the atmosphere in Jerusalem during this week. The entire city, and indeed every town and village, would transform into a sprawling, makeshift tent city. Booths would spring up everywhere, in courtyards, on rooftops, in fields, and even balanced on narrow balconies. The stability of home gave way to the delightful uncertainty of a fragile outdoor existence. The entire architecture of daily life was turned on its head. The rules for building a sukkah were meticulous and beautifully strange, designed to ensure that the structure felt temporary and reliant on nature. The walls could be made of sturdy materials, like wood or canvas, but the roof, known as the speck, had to be made from unprocessed, detached plant material, such as bamboo, palm fronds, or evergreen branches. This roof was the key to the entire ritual's meaning. The most bizarre, yet essential rule concerning the speck was its purpose. It had to provide more shade than sunlight during the day, yet it also had to be sparse enough that the stars could be clearly seen at night. The ceiling, usually the most protective part of any dwelling, was deliberately rendered vulnerable and porous. The person sleeping inside the sukkah was perpetually exposed to the elements, reminded nightly of the vastness of the sky above and the thinness of the barrier separating them from the universe. This was not a comfortable command. People ate their meals, entertained guests, and slept under this semi-open, weather-dependent roof for a full week. If it rained, the command was often to leave the hut, as God did not require suffering, but the message remained. Permanent comfort is an illusion. The whole point was to physically feel the impermanence of existence and the certainty of divine shelter. The decorations of the sukkah were also a central feature of the festival. People would hang fruits, nuts, flowers, and streamers from the rafters, transforming the sparse hut into a festive, garden-like space. This decorative joy was a celebration of the completed ingathering of the autumn harvest, giving thanks for the agricultural bounty that allowed them to rest. The spiritual memory of the desert and the physical reality of the harvest blended perfectly inside the temporary walls. Sukkot was commanded to be a time of intense joy. It is referred to as the season of our rejoicing in ancient texts. Leaving the house and living outdoors was an exercise in vulnerability that strangely led to profound happiness, a sense of liberation from the burdens of domestic stability and ownership. The festival effectively dissolved the rigid boundaries between neighbors, as everyone was forced out of their private spaces and into communal proximity. But living in the hut was only half of the ritual. The other half involved the daily carrying and waving of a specific collection of plant materials, the most important harvest items of the festival. These items were essential tools for a specific temple ceremony, a ritual that focused the body's movements and the eye's attention on the natural world that surrounded their fragile booths. This movement of plants, representing the totality of the natural world, is what we must turn our attention to next as we explore the oddly compelling choreography of the four species ritual. Stepping out of the fragile walls of the sukkah, we now focus on the strange botanical heart of the Feast of Booths, the carrying and waving of the Arba'at Haminim, or the four species. This was an active, mobile ritual that contrasted beautifully with the static, temporary living of the booth itself. It involved a careful gathering of four distinct plants, each symbolizing a different aspect of the person or the land. The four species included a palm branch, lulav, 3 myrtle branches, hedas, 2 willow branches, arava, and 1 perfect citron, etrog. The myrtle and willow were bound together with the palm, forming a kind of leafy scepter, while the citron was held separately in the other hand. The selection of these items was highly meticulous. The citron, in particular, had to be unblemished and often commanded an extravagant price, making it a source of great pride and expense for families. The palm, lulav, represented the spine, symbolizing uprightness and strength. The myrtle, with its sweet fragrance but inedible berry, often symbolized those who performed good deeds but perhaps lacked scholarly knowledge. The willow, which has no scent or taste, represented those with neither deep study nor great deeds. Finally, the citron, etrog, which possesses both a pleasant taste and a wonderful scent, symbolized those who excelled in both wisdom and action. Bound together, these four diverse plants represented the unity and collective dependence of the entire community, celebrating their differences as a necessary whole. During the 7 days of Sukkot, every morning, pilgrims in Jerusalem would gather up these four species and perform a theatrical, rhythmic ritual. They would hold the palm branch and the citron, bring them together, and then wave them in 6 directions: east, south, west, north, up toward the sky, and down toward the earth. This comprehensive waving symbolized the omnipotence of God and the dedication of the entire physical world, in all its directions and dimensions, to the divine. The ritual was often accompanied by joyous shouts and the chanting of specific psalms. The air would be filled with the rustling of the leaves and the collective, rhythmic movement of thousands of people, all repeating the same choreography. This was a noisy, physically engaging religious experience, a far cry from the quiet introspection of Yom Kippur. It was a visible, sensory celebration of being alive and of the land's fertility. A related, and perhaps even more boisterous, ceremony performed during Sukkot was the water-drawing ceremony, or Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Though not explicitly commanded in the Torah, this celebration became central to the festival. Every morning, a procession would descend from the Temple Mount to the Pool of Siloam. The priest would fill a golden pitcher with water and carry it back up to the altar amidst huge crowds, torchlight, singing, and dancing. This ceremony was not just about water. It was a prayer for rain, essential for the winter crops. It was considered such a moment of pure, unbridled joy that the ancient rabbis claimed that he who has not witnessed the rejoicing of the water-drawing ceremony has never seen true joy. The sound of the shofar and the crash of cymbals would fill the air as the water was poured onto the altar, mingling with the wine offerings. The sensory details of this festival, the gentle smell of the citron, the swaying of the palms, the vibrant singing, the chaotic construction of the booths, and the deep sound of the water being poured, all combined to create a week that felt intensely real and immediate. This was a spirituality rooted firmly in the soil and the seasons. The final act of the water drawing, the sudden, deliberate pouring of the liquid onto the altar, was an audible, definitive sound that signaled the transition from one season to the next. The boisterous, life-affirming sound of the water and the trumpets prepared the people for the next dramatic sound that marked the major shift in the liturgical year. That sound, often described as a cry of awakening and judgment, is the insistent, varied blasts of the ram's horn, bringing us toward the Feast of Trumpets. The calendar turns from the joyous outdoor celebration of Sukkot, and we land squarely on one of the most solemn, yet orally demanding days of the year, the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah. Contrary to its later status as the New Year, the biblical observance was primarily designated as a day of sounding the alarm, a day of memory, and a day of judgment. It was a day of loud noises, signaled by the insistent, varied blasts of the ram's horn, the shofar. If you imagine a sound designed not to comfort or entertain, but to pierce the soul and demand attention, you are imagining the sound of the shofar. The instruction was clear. The day was to be a Yom Teruah, a day of shouting, or more accurately, a day of noise that awakened and judged. This powerful, primal sound served as a wake-up call to repentance, initiating the 10-day period that culminated in the absolute self-denial of Yom Kippur. The shofar itself was typically a simple ram's horn, often left unadorned, maintaining a connection to the raw, rugged simplicity of the pastoral past. Its sound was categorized into 3 distinct, required blasts, each with its own spiritual significance and auditory pattern. First, there was the Tekiah, a single, long, continuous, triumphant blast that sounded like a coronation or a clarion call. It was a smooth, clear note, signifying sovereignty and God's kingship over the universe. It was the sound of a decree being announced, demanding immediate attention from all creation. Next came the shevarim, a series of 3 broken, sobbing notes. This sound was irregular and mournful, meant to symbolize the brokenness of the human heart, the tears of repentance, and the fragility of the soul when confronted with judgment. This was the sound of internal struggle, a cry for mercy. Finally, there was the teruah, a rapid, staccato burst of 9 quick, short notes, a kind of agitated, urgent trembling. This sound was meant to mimic an alarm or a war cry, signifying the urgency of the moment and the immediacy of the judgment to come. It was a frantic, chaotic sound designed to shake the listener out of complacency. The ritual required the entire community to hear a set number of these combined blasts, performed in specific sequences throughout the day. It wasn't enough just to be in the vicinity. The commandment was about the internal act of hearing the sound and allowing it to penetrate the soul. It was a command to stop all labor, gather in solemn assembly, and listen to this sonic representation of their relationship with the divine. The blasts were meant to serve as a memory before God, a reminder of the covenant made with their ancestors, and the binding of Isaac, which was traditionally associated with the ram's horn. The ram's horn was the physical remnant of the animal sacrificed in Isaac's stead, making the sound a permanent plea for mercy based on that act of historical faith. The sound was simultaneously historical, existential, and prophetic. Think of the psychological effect of this day, the solemn assembly, the quiet of the crowd, shattered repeatedly by these loud, visceral, sometimes jarring sounds. It was impossible to ignore. The shofar's cry was designed to awaken the moral consciousness of every person, forcing them to confront their actions and their standing before God before the final decree of Yom Kippur was sealed. The sound was an invitation to a serious, self-reflective audit of the preceding year. The deliberate sound of the shofar set the national calendar in motion, initiating the 10 days of spiritual intensity. The transition here is from the loud, demanding, once-a-year sound of judgment to the quiet, subtle, and constant rhythm that defined the ancient week and month. The shofar shouted, but another, smaller, more frequent observance quietly kept the rhythm of existence. This shift from the sound of cosmic alarm to the visual observance of time brings us to the quiet, astronomical focus of the monthly festivals, the festival of the new moon. Having explored the massive, yearly alarms of the shofar, we now turn to a more subtle, constant, an utterly essential observance that defined the rhythm of life. The Festival of the New Moon, or Rosh Chodesh. If the great annual festivals anchored the year, the appearance of the new crescent moon anchored every month, linking the human calendar directly to the cosmic cycle. This monthly observance was deeply important both astronomically and spiritually, yet it often lacked the grand public pilgrimage and universal cessation of labor seen during the major festivals. It was a time of renewal, marked by special sacrifices in the temple and a slight reprieve from work, particularly for women, who often observed it as a minor holiday. The most fascinating aspect of Rosh Chodesh was how the new month was determined. In the earliest, pre-calculated calendar system, the month was not simply declared by formula. It required human visual testimony. The start of the new month was dependent on two reliable witnesses actually seeing the faint sliver of the new crescent moon in the sky, often just after sunset. This dependence on human sight made the start of the month an exciting and occasionally tense affair. Imagine the high anticipation. Groups of appointed observers would gather on the surrounding hilltops and wait. The moment two reliable witnesses spotted the moon, they would rush to the rabbinical court in Jerusalem to give their testimony. Their account had to be cross-examined, ensuring that they had truly seen the moon and not a cloud, a reflection, or a trick of the light. Once the court was satisfied with the testimony, the new month was officially declared. This declaration was a moment of public urgency. Since there were no digital clocks or shared calendars, the news had to be spread immediately. In earlier times, beacon fires were lit on a chain of designated hilltops stretching across the land. The first fire, ignited in Jerusalem, would signal the start, and the next hill would light its fire as soon as it saw the first, creating a rapid, spectacular chain reaction of flame across the night landscape. Later, due to confusion and potential sabotage, messengers were dispatched instead to carry the news by word of mouth. The declaration of Rosh Chodesh held immense practical and spiritual power because it determined the exact date of every subsequent festival, including Yom Kippur and Passover. A mistake in determining the new month could throw the entire annual religious calendar into disarray. This necessity for human observation and testimony placed humanity as a co-creator of time, linking the physical observation of the cosmos with the divine command. In the temple, the declaration of the new month was marked by special sacrifices, including a goat offered as a unique sin offering. It was a day of transition, a moment to reset the spiritual clock and acknowledge the cyclical nature of existence. The moon itself became a symbol of renewal, shrinking to nothingness and then steadily growing back to fullness, mirroring the human cycle of repentance and return. The concept of a specific, required separation from the world, a mandatory break from the normal rhythm, was beautifully enshrined in this monthly cycle. The idea of marking time by the moon's precise visual cycle of waxing and waning leads us to consider the conscious, almost mystical separation of certain individuals from the world's cycles altogether. That voluntary, total separation, defined by rules around hair, wine, and death, is the profoundly unique commitment known as the vow of the Nazarite, which awaits us next. Following the consistent astronomical rhythm of the new moon, we now encounter a separation from the world that was not mandatory or periodic, but entirely voluntary, personal, and profoundly unique. The vow of the Nazarite. While most of the laws we have explored define the entire nation, the Nazarite vow was a deliberate choice by an individual, male or female, to enter a temporary, self-imposed state of extreme holiness, a life set apart from the common stream of existence. This vow of consecration was an act of personal devotion, an attempt to live a life momentarily dedicated to a higher, more rigorous spiritual standard than the rest of the community. The word Nazirite simply means one who is separated or consecrated. This was a person who willingly chose to step out of the common flow of life for a defined period, dedicating themselves to a heightened level of spiritual purity. The vow required 3 specific, seemingly arbitrary, and yet highly restrictive rules that cut the person off from the most common, daily elements of their world, transforming their lifestyle into a sustained, meditative discipline. The first, and perhaps most challenging prohibition, was abstaining from all products of the grape. This meant no wine, no fermented drink, no grapes, no raisins, and crucially, no grape seeds or skins, effectively banning the entire output of the vineyard. In the ancient world, where water was often unsafe and wine was the staple social beverage, the very drink that defined celebration, comfort, and hospitality, this abstinence created a dramatic social barrier. The Nazarite was sober by divine command, isolated from the communal joy and comfort derived from the vine. This separation from alcohol was designed to ensure mental clarity and self-control, symbolizing a dedication to a higher, unclouded purpose. Their life became a deliberate, prolonged fast from the most pervasive symbol of luxury and worldly delight, ensuring that their focus remained purely celestial. The second restriction concerned the Nazarite's hair. For the entire duration of the vow, a razor was never to touch their head. The hair was allowed to grow long and wild, becoming a visible, physical sign of their separation and consecration. In a culture where neatness and order were often valued, this untamed, flowing hair made the Nazarite instantly recognizable as a person under a special, supernatural contract. It became a living crown of purity, a physical symbol of the life energy that was being dedicated to the divine. This long hair had to be constantly managed, constantly protected, as its cutting would immediately terminate the vow. The accumulation of hair symbolized the accumulated sanctity of their separated time. It was a physical manifestation of the devotion they were storing up. The third and most paradoxical rule required the Nazarite to avoid all contact with the dead, including even their closest relatives. If a parent, sibling, or child died, the Nazarite could not attend the funeral or go near the body, nor could they enter any space where a corpse lay. This separation from death was necessary to maintain the ultimate level of ritual purity, making their life a bubble of pure vitality, shielded from the ultimate defiling force. This rule often placed the Nazirite in a deeply uncomfortable position, forcing a choice between the spiritual mandate and the profound human duty of mourning, emphasizing that their commitment transcended even familial ties. The most precarious part of the Nazirite vow was its fragility. If, during the period of consecration, the individual accidentally came into contact with a corpse, perhaps unknowingly, passing through a cave containing old bones, or being near someone who suddenly died, the entire vow was instantly shattered. All the weeks or months of dedication were nullified. The person had to immediately undergo an elaborate, costly process of purification, shave their head completely, and then, most inconveniently, start the entire period of the vow over again from day one. This demonstrated the impossible standard of perfect purity and the ever-present threat of the common world to the consecrated state. When the voluntary period of the vow was finally complete, the termination was marked by an equally elaborate required ritual. The Nazirite, having concluded their time of separation, was required to shave all the hair, the crown that had grown long and wild, and burn it on the temple altar as part of their final set of sacrifices. This act symbolized the transfer of all that consecrated energy back to the source, marking their release back into the common stream of life, where they could once again drink wine, cut their hair, and be present for the full range of human experience. This was a necessary return to the ordinary, acknowledging that such extreme holiness was not meant to be a permanent state for humanity. The commitment of the Nazirite, which demanded such radical separation from the common elements of daily life, wine, scissors, and death, naturally brings our attention to the laws that governed what one could or could not consume, not just for a season, but every single day. The strict, self-imposed boundaries of the Nazirite now give way to the mandatory, deeply communal boundaries of the nation's diet. This transition from individual purity to national purity leads us directly to the weird, often bizarre, list of forbidden and permitted animals that define the daily structure of life. The laws of kashrut. If the Nazirite vow was an individual's choice to draw a spiritual line, the laws of kashrut, the ancient dietary laws, were a line drawn around the entire community, defining the very essence of their separation from the surrounding nations. These laws dictated what could, and perhaps more importantly, what absolutely could not, pass through the lips and enter the body of an Israelite. It was a mandatory, daily discipline that reinforced the concept of a separated or holy people, defining their identity around the meal table and in the marketplace. The list of permitted and forbidden animals found in the Torah is bizarre, intricate, and often seems entirely arbitrary to the modern mind. They were not based on simple hygiene or contemporary health trends, or even simple preference. They were based on a deeply theological and spiritual system of classification that marked animals as either whole and ordered or incomplete and chaotic. This system valued creatures that lived in harmony with their own nature and within the orderly structure of their environment. For land animals, the rules were surprisingly straightforward, requiring two specific physical signs to be present simultaneously for the animal to be considered clean and edible. The animal had to both chew its cud and have completely cloven hooves, meaning the hoof was fully split into two distinct parts. Animals that only possessed one of these traits, such as the pig, cloven hooves, but does not chew the cud, or the camel, chews the cud but does not have truly cloven hooves, were strictly forbidden. Imagine the ancient hunter or farmer carefully examining the mouth and the foot of every animal before deeming it fit for consumption, turning the simple identification of livestock into a meticulous ritual of discernment. The symbolism of these signs is profound. The chewing of the cud represents internal rumination and meditation, suggesting a quiet, deliberate way of consuming and processing sustenance. The cloven hoof symbolizes walking on the earth with a clear, divided path, suggesting a defined and ordered separation from the wild, untamed ground. An animal that possessed both traits was considered a creature of balance and order, fit for the diet of a holy nation. When it came to the waters, the rules were equally precise, separating the edible fish from the forbidden. For a creature from the sea or river to be deemed clean, it had to have both fins and scales. Fish like tuna or carp were fine, but any creature that slithered, crawled, or lacked these two features, such as eels, shellfish, crabs, or squid, was utterly forbidden. The sea, usually seen as a symbol of chaotic, untamed nature, was carefully partitioned into the orderly and the disorderly. Scales and fins represented movement that was orderly and defined, rather than the chaotic, bottom-feeding motion of creatures without these features. The most challenging list was that of the birds. Unlike the clear, physical markers for land and sea creatures, the Torah lists a long, somewhat arbitrary, and often untranslatable collection of forbidden birds. The list generally seemed to prohibit predatory birds, scavengers, and birds of prey, encouraging the consumption of domesticated fowl and certain seed-eaters. This suggested a moral underpinning to the law, urging the people to consume creatures that lived a life of peace and order, rather than those of violent consumption, subtly shaping the moral character of the nation through its diet. Beyond the specific animal, there were also bizarre and strict rules governing the combinations of food. The most famous prohibition was the law against mixing milk and meat, often summarized as, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." This was understood to forbid the cooking or eating of any mammal meat and dairy products together, reinforcing a sense of compassion and separation between life and death, prohibiting the combination of a life-giving substance with the product of death. The effect of these detailed dietary laws was profound. It necessitated a completely different approach to slaughter, cooking, and communal dining. Every meal became a constant, conscious reminder of the sacred covenant that separated them from their neighbors. Dining together was not merely a social act. It was a ritual act of shared spiritual identity, creating a culinary bubble around the nation that defined them in every aspect of their daily routine. The meticulous examination of animals, the separation of dairy and meat, and the constant awareness of the forbidden reinforced a worldview of divine order. If holiness meant separating the sacred from the profane, then these food laws were the daily, practical expression of that holiness. This deep, required separation concerning what went into the body naturally leads to a similarly strange law governing what was forbidden to mix on the land itself. The boundaries and rules that separated types of food are about to be applied to seeds, animals, and fabrics, bringing us to an even stranger law of separation in agriculture, the prohibition known as kilaim. We have seen the separation mandated in diet, cutting the people off from certain chaotic creatures. Now, we explore an even stranger, more fundamental law of separation, the prohibition against mixing species known as kilaim. This law extended the principle of maintaining distinctness from the dinner plate to the field, the stable, and the very clothes one wore. It treated the mixing of certain natural elements not just as poor agricultural practice, but as an act of moral or spiritual confusion. The law of kilaim forbade the blending of certain specified species, based on the belief that God had created each species with its own unique integrity, and mixing them was seen as attempting to undo or confuse the divine order of creation. It was a command to respect the distinct boundaries set by the Creator, ensuring that the natural world remained defined by its original categories. The human role was not to blur the lines of creation, but to maintain the clear distinctions established by the divine word. The prohibition was first applied to the field. A farmer was strictly forbidden from sowing two different kinds of seeds together in the same plot of ground. For example, planting wheat and barley side by side was permitted, but intermingling their seeds in the same row was considered an act of mixing, a forbidden hybridity. This required extraordinary care during planting, turning the simple act of sowing into a meticulous, separate discipline. The farmer, who spent his life merging and managing the elements of nature for sustenance, was here commanded to practice radical restraint and respect the inherent boundaries between plant types. This applied not just to grains, but to all seeds, forcing a clear division between all different types of crops. The prohibition was not limited to plants. It extended to animals used for labor. The law strictly forbade the use of two different kinds of animals pulling the same plow or carriage. A farmer could not yoke an ox and a donkey together. While the practical reason might include the welfare of the weaker animal, which would struggle to keep pace with the stronger, the spiritual dimension was about respecting the distinct nature and purpose of each creature. They must remain separate, whole, and unmixed in their work. The blending of disparate animals in labor was seen as an unnatural imposition on the divine order, even in the context of human work. Perhaps the strangest application of kilaim was the prohibition concerning clothing, known as sha'atnez. This law forbade the wearing of a garment made by blending linen, a plant fiber, and wool, an animal fiber. The two most common and essential materials of ancient clothing were commanded to be kept separate, even though blending them could produce a more durable and comfortable fabric. While commentators have offered many possible explanations, ranging from a protest against pagan rituals to a respect for the first sacrifice, the effect was a daily, constant requirement to verify the fabric of one's own clothing. A person was to be a walking declaration of distinctiveness, carrying the separation of creation's elements on their very body. This whole set of laws created a unique and profound philosophical statement. The world was not meant to be a blur of undifferentiated elements. but a beautiful mosaic of discrete categories. By respecting the boundaries between seeds, between working animals, and between natural fibers, the Israelite was actively participating in the maintenance of creation's original, ordered state. The message was that boundaries are not just restrictive, they are defining and protective of identity and integrity. The rigor required by these laws infused the mundane details of life with spiritual consequence. The farmer had to manage his field with hyper-awareness, and the weaver had to be meticulous in their loom work, all because of an unseen boundary established at the beginning of time. This required a constant, deep examination of the most common materials and actions, ensuring that the human quest for efficiency never violated the sacred taxonomy of nature. The boundaries defined by Kilayim were about respecting the intrinsic nature of the species. This respect for the ordered, separate integrity of the elements within the land leads us to the final, most radical law concerning the land itself. A law that required the ultimate act of restraint and faith. If a farmer couldn't mix two seeds, what happens when the entire agricultural cycle is commanded to stop? This shift from the laws defining the boundaries within the land to the law defining the boundaries of the land's time brings us to the astonishing concept of the sabbatical year. We have seen the yearly cycles of festivals and the daily cycles of separation in diet and dress. Now, we come to the most radical, economically devastating, and spiritually profound cycle of all, the sabbatical year, or Shemitah. This law was not about a festival or a vow. It was about the absolute, mandatory resting of the entire land every seventh year. It was the land's own Sabbath, a year-long cessation of human labor. The commandment was simple and absolute. For 6 years, you may sow your fields, prune your vineyards, and gather your produce, living under the assumption that your toil would yield your sustenance. But the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to God. In that year, there was to be no sowing of seeds, no selective pruning of vines, and no harvesting of the crops that grew spontaneously. The land itself was commanded to lie fallow, to rest from the relentless imposition of human will and production. Imagine the sheer audacity and the economic shockwaves of this command echoing through an agrarian society, where survival was measured in the success of the harvest. This law required the populace to stop all primary production for a full year, deliberately interrupting the most fundamental economic activity. It was the ultimate test of faith, demanding that the entire economy be based not on human effort for 1 year, but on absolute divine provision. The failure to trust this promise was tantamount to a failure of faith in the entire covenant. The question everyone must have asked was simple and anxious. What will we eat? How can we survive for a full year without planting? The divine answer, woven into the command, was equally simple and reassuring. God would command an extra-large harvest on the 6th year, enough to sustain the people through the 6th year itself, the entire 7th sabbatical year of rest, and even the beginning of the 8th year until the new crops ripened. This required a total, unwavering commitment to a promise that was invisible until the moment it was needed, placing the entire nation's trust not in their own diligence, but in the miraculous provision of the harvest. But the sabbatical year was not just about economic rest. It had a powerful social dimension, acting as a massive engine for social justice. The law also commanded the complete cancellation of all debts owed between Israelites, debts which might have accumulated over the 6 years of work, perhaps through loan defaults or poor harvests, were wiped clean at the close of the 7th year. This acted as a radical, divinely mandated economic reset, preventing the permanent accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, and ensuring that the poor, who had fallen into debt, had a constant opportunity to begin again with a clean slate. It protected the dignity of the impoverished. Furthermore, any spontaneous produce that grew during the sabbatical year, the self-grown harvest, was declared ownerless and freely available to everyone, the farmer, the laborer, the stranger, and even the wild beasts. The abundance that the land naturally produced belonged to no one person, transforming the field from private property into a communal pantry, a shared resource for all living things. This fostered a profound sense of shared dependence and eliminated the distinction between the wealthy landowner and the desperate wanderer, reinforcing the idea of the land belonging ultimately to God. The observance of Shemitah became the ultimate expression of trust and humility. The farmer, standing in his unsown field, was forced to acknowledge that he was not the true owner of the land. He was merely a tenant under a higher landlord. His labor was only productive because of the grace that commanded the soil to yield, and for a whole year he was required to relinquish his assumed control. The law served as a constant reminder that the rhythm of time and the principle of rest were more important than the relentless pursuit of profit. It was a required break from the endless cycle of production and consumption, allowing the land to regenerate and the human spirit to remember its reliance on the spiritual, not the material. It was an enforced year of rest, study, and profound social justice, a year where human hierarchies dissolved before the divine command. This culmination of the 7-year cycle, the profound rest of the land, and the reset of all human accounts, naturally leads to the ultimate and final rest cycle. If 7 years brought a temporary economic release, the end of 7 such cycles brought a final universal release that transcended the human lifespan. That ultimate reset, defined by the return of all ancestral property and the liberation of slaves, is the astonishing, far-reaching law known as the Jubilee Year. The 7-year cycle of the sabbatical year, or Shemitah, was already a profound disruption to the common order of life. But the laws of time did not stop there. The entire nation was commanded to endure 7 such cycles, 7 times 7 years, totaling 49 years, culminating in the astonishing and utterly unique 50th year, the Yovel or Jubilee year. This was the ultimate rest cycle, the final, absolute reset button for the entire economic and social structure of the nation. The Jubilee year was announced with the massive, celebratory sound of the shofar, not the mournful blast of Rosh Hashanah, but a triumphant call of freedom that echoed throughout the land on the Day of Atonement. The timing was significant. Only after the community had achieved spiritual cleansing on Yom Kippur. Could they be ready for the complete social and economic cleansing of the Jubilee? The radical nature of the Jubilee lay in two fundamental commands that instantaneously and permanently changed the life of every family and every person in the land. First, and most economically disruptive, was the command that all ancestral land must revert to its original owner. The land itself could never be permanently sold. It could only be leased until the next Jubilee. Imagine a person who had fallen into debt and was forced to sell their family's ancestral field 30 years before the Jubilee. The buyer, knowing they could use the land for 30 years, would pay a price based on the number of remaining harvests. But the moment the Jubilee shofar sounded, the contract was nullified, and the field returned to the seller without any compensation due to the current user. This system ensured that no family could be permanently impoverished or landless, and it prevented the concentration of all the nation's wealth into the hands of a few powerful families. Every 50 years, the playing field was level, and the original, God-given distribution of the land was restored. This massive, mandated redistribution of wealth reinforced the theological principle that the land belonged ultimately to God, and human beings were merely temporary tenants. The second fundamental command of the Jubilee was the liberation of all enslaved people of Hebrew origin. If a person had become so destitute that they had to sell themselves or their children into servitude to pay off a debt, the Jubilee instantly set them free. This was a universal, non-negotiable liberation, granting every person a chance to return to their family, their land, and their original status as a free member of the covenant community. This law placed a definitive limit on human bondage, ensuring that debt servitude was never permanent and that the dignity of the person was preserved over the obligation of the debt. It was a yearly, solemn reminder that they themselves had been slaves in Egypt and were commanded to treat others accordingly. The Jubilee year was also commanded to be a year of rest for the land, just like the sabbatical year. No sowing or reaping was permitted. This meant that the people had to subsist on the accumulated provision from the 48th year, requiring an even greater leap of faith and management than the normal sabbatical cycle. The combined effect of these laws, the release of all debt, the return of all land, and the freedom of all bondservants, was to maintain a continuous cycle of opportunity. It guaranteed that economic setbacks were not permanent punishments, and that the society would always self-correct against inequality and exploitation. It was a profound declaration that human worth was not tied to one's temporary financial status, but to one's permanent place in the community. The sheer scale of this social and economic reset defined the life and culture of the nation, constantly reminding them of the sanctity of their ancestral inheritance and the ultimate ownership of the divine. The concept of everything reverting to its original owner and the deep sanctity of property held in trust leads us to the mystery of the one object that defined God's immediate presence on earth. The mysterious objects used by the high priest to seek direct divine communication. That shift from economic law to sacred mystery brings us to the enigma of the Urim and Thummim. Having established the grand, cosmic rhythms of the Jubilee and sabbatical cycles, which governed the life of the nation every 7 and 50 years, we now turn our attention to an object that governed the day-to-day decisions of the nation, an object wrapped in profound mystery. The Urim and Thummim. These were two strange, unexplained objects housed within the breastplate worn by the high priest, used to receive divine guidance on matters of national importance. The Bible offers no clear description of what the Urim and Thummim actually looked like, their composition, or precisely how they functioned. The names themselves are enigmatic. Urim is often translated as lights or illuminations, and Thummim as perfections or completeness. This suggests they were tools of clarity and truth, designed to deliver a perfect, undeniable answer when the nation faced an existential dilemma or a crucial military decision. We know that these objects were placed within a special pouch behind the breastplate of judgment, which itself contained 12 precious stones, each engraved with the name of one of the tribes of Israel. This placement meant that the high priest carried the names of the entire nation close to his heart when he stood before the divine presence, a constant reminder of his representative role. The Urim and Thummim were the mechanism through which the nation, represented by the priest, could query God directly. The method of use is as mysterious as the objects themselves. Traditionally, it is believed they operated through a form of sacred casting of lots, or, more vividly, through a miraculous illumination of the stones on the breastplate. A question, always simple and requiring a yes, no, or clear choice answer, would be posed by the high priest. The answer would then manifest visually, perhaps by specific letters on the 12 stones lighting up to spell out a word or phrase, or perhaps by one of the objects being drawn out, representing one of the two possible outcomes. The resulting message was absolute and binding, directing the path of kings and the movement of armies. Imagine the atmosphere in the sanctuary during such an inquiry. The nation's leaders stand waiting, silent and anxious. The high priest, cloaked in his elaborate, holy garments, enters the designated area. He poses the question, perhaps regarding an invasion or a settlement decision. All eyes are fixed on the array of precious stones on his chest. There is no audible voice, no written text, only the possibility of a sudden, undeniable illumination, a burst of light and clarity that provides the nation's marching orders. It was a form of direct, non-verbal communication that bypassed human wisdom and relied entirely on sacred phenomenon. The existence of the Urim and Thummim highlights the unique way in which guidance was sought in the ancient world. It was not left to the whim of a single leader, nor solely to the interpretation of prophecy, but often to this enigmatic, physical mechanism embedded within the priestly office. Over time, the use of the Urim and Thummim seemed to fade, eventually ceasing entirely, a mystery perhaps too close to the divine to be sustained in the common world. The sheer mystery surrounding their appearance and how this enigmatic form of communication shaped national decisions makes the Urim and Thummim a powerful symbol of sacred dependence. The clothing that held these critical, guiding items, the breastplate, and the rest of the high priest's elaborate uniform, serves as the natural bridge to our next subject, the full wardrobe of the priesthood, a set of garments defined by color, material, and a curious auditory element. The mystery of the Urim and Thummim was contained not in a simple box, but within a magnificent, highly specific, an elaborately detailed uniform worn by the high priest. The priestly garments were not mere clothing. They were ritual objects in cloth, designed to confer dignity and beauty upon the wearer, distinguishing them from the common populace and setting them apart for their sacred service. Every material, color, and stitch carried a profound symbolic meaning. The full uniform consisted of 8 distinct garments, the most prominent of which were the ephod, the breastplate, the robe, and the mitre. The ephod was a colorful, vest-like garment worn over a tunic, made of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet threads, interwoven with finely twisted linen. It was a complex piece of weaving, secured by 2 onyx stones on the shoulder straps, each stone engraved with the names of 6 of the tribes of Israel. This again reinforced the idea that the priest carried the weight and the representation of the entire nation on his shoulders, both literally and figuratively. Attached to the ephod, and indeed the focal point of the entire garment, was the breastplate of judgment. This was a square, folded piece of cloth, also made of the same 4 colorful threads, housing the 12 precious stones, arranged in 4 rows of 3. Each stone, shining brilliantly, was engraved with the name of a tribe, symbolizing the high priest's role as the advocate for the entire 12-tribal nation before the divine. It was within the pouch of this breastplate that the mysterious Urim and Thummim were placed, serving as the interface between the mundane world and the source of ultimate wisdom. Below the ephod and breastplate was the robe, made entirely of blue material, a color symbolizing the heavens and purity. It was a long, seamless, flowing garment that descended to the feet. But the most curious and acoustically unique feature of the robe was found around its lower hem. Attached alternately to the hem of the robe were small golden bells and pomegranate-shaped tassels, woven from blue, purple, and scarlet wool. These golden bells were not merely decorative. They served a crucial, life-preserving function. The command explicitly stated that the bells must ring when the priest ministered in the holy place. The sound served as a strange, musical safety measure. His sound shall be heard when he goes into the holy place before the Lord, and when he comes out, so that he will not die. Imagine the quiet, fearful atmosphere inside the sanctuary. The high priest, alone and separated by massive curtains from the rest of the priests, performed his sacred rites. The only sound emanating from that holiest space would be the delicate, rhythmic, and constant tinkling of those golden bells. The bells acted as an announcement of life and movement. They were the sound of the priest's presence, assuring both the people and perhaps symbolically the divine presence itself that the priest was alive and moving, properly executing his duties without being struck down by a ritual error. If the bells fell silent, it might have been an indication that he had failed and perished within the sanctity of the chamber. The sound served as a link between the terrifying silence of the divine presence and the anxious world outside. The entire uniform, from the glittering stones of the breastplate to the humble linen of the undergarment, symbolized a complex theology of representation, purity, and reverence. The colors and materials represented the various elements of creation. The gold for light and divinity, the blue for the heavens, the purple for royalty, and the linen for earth and humanity. This discussion of unique ritualistic clothing, defined by its color and a mandated auditory element for the priest, leads naturally to another item of mandated wear for every single Israelite. If the priest had his constant reminder in the bells on his hem, the rest of the nation had their own constant, visible reminder of their duties. A shift from the specific holiness of the high priest to the communal holiness of every member of the covenant. That universal sign of commitment is the law of the tassels. Having explored the profound ritualistic clothing of the high priest, defined by gold, jewels, and the life-preserving sound of the bells, we now turn our focus to a far simpler, yet universally commanded item of mandated wear: the tzitzit. These were fringes or tassels that every Israelite male was commanded to wear on the four corners of his outer garment. This was a law designed not for the elite or the consecrated few, but as a constant, visible, and tactile reminder of the covenant for every single person. The command was straightforward: speak to the children of Israel and tell them to make for themselves tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put upon the tassel of the corner a thread of blue. The tassels, essentially a bundle of knotted threads, had to be attached to the four corners of any garment that had such corners. The ordinary daily act of getting dressed or walking about became infused with spiritual meaning. The core purpose of the tzitzit was memory. The verse explained that when the wearer looked upon the tassel, they would be reminded of all the commandments of the divine, and would consequently observe them and avoid following the impulses of their own eyes and heart. The tassel acted as a spiritual tether, a constant physical interruption to the flow of daily life, pulling the wearer back to the commitment of the covenant. It was a tangible prompt for holiness, visible proof of their identity as a separated people. The most distinctive and vital component of the tassel was the single thread of a specific ritual blue dye, known as techelet. The presence of this blue thread transformed the tassel from a mere knot into a ritual object. The blue color was understood to symbolize the color of the sea and the color of the sky, and ultimately the color of the divine throne of glory. It was a piece of heaven woven into the corner of an earthly garment, visually connecting the wearer to the celestial realm and their ultimate sacred duty. The process of obtaining this specific blue dye was fraught with difficulty and complexity, which only added to its sacred value. Techelet was derived from a specific type of sea creature, a snail known as the Murex trunculus, found in the Mediterranean Sea. The dye-making process was laborious and costly, requiring thousands of these tiny snails to produce a small quantity of the rich, deep blue color. This rarity and difficulty made the blue thread a precious, valued element of the tassel, reserved only for this sacred command. The disappearance of the knowledge of how to produce techelet centuries ago made the command partially unfulfillable for a long period, lending an even greater sense of mystery and loss to the law. Yet, the physical act of wearing the knotted white tassels remained a central expression of identity and commitment, even without the sacred blue thread. Imagine the Israelite walking through the marketplace, the tassels gently swaying at the corners of his cloak. Every time the tassel caught his eye or touched his hand, he was reminded of the 613 commandments, the entire moral and legal framework of his existence. It was a pervasive, low-level sensory anchor, turning a simple piece of clothing into a profound spiritual mechanism. The constant, visible reminder of the tassels and their connection to the home and the body naturally segues to the laws that govern the home itself. If the individual was commanded to mark the boundary of his garment, the house was commanded to mark its boundary in an equally visible and permanent way. That visible mark, which protected and defined the sacred space of the dwelling, is the mezuzah. We move now from the visible, external markers of holiness, the tassels on the garment, and the jubilee boundaries on the land, to perhaps the most paradoxical and deeply inexplicable ritual commanded in the entire body of law, the sacrifice of the red heifer. This ritual was not about sin or guilt or atonement in the usual sense. It was about the purest form of ritual purity, cleansing the deepest possible external contamination that incurred by contact with death. The law concerning the red heifer was fraught with paradox from its very beginning. The heifer had to be perfectly red, entirely without blemish, and, critically, it must never have worn a yoke or performed any work. This requirement for a flawless, unmarred animal that had never been used for any profane purpose speaks to the immense sanctity required for this unique ritual. The animal was led outside the camp or the city, away from the sanctity of the main altar, and sacrificed there. Following the sacrifice, the animal was not merely butchered, it was burned completely, entirely, along with its hide, flesh, blood, and even its dung. To the rising smoke and ashes were added a few highly symbolic elements: cedar wood, hyssop, a small cleansing herb, and a thread of scarlet wool. All these elements were consumed in the fire, leaving behind a fine, potent pile of gray ash. These ashes, which represented the absolute consumption of a life for the purpose of purification, were then mixed with fresh running water, what the text calls living water, to create the final product, the water of purification. This was the sole, indispensable substance required to remove the ritual contamination known as tumat met, the defilement contracted by touching a human corpse or entering a space where a corpse lay. This contamination by death was considered the ultimate form of ritual impurity, rendering a person incapable of entering the sanctuary or participating in any sacred rites. The contamination lasted for 7 days and required a specific ritual sprinkling with the water of purification on the 3rd and 7th days before the person could be declared clean. But here lies the profound paradox that makes the red heifer ritual so unique and mystifying. While the water of purification cleansed the person who was contaminated by death, it simultaneously contaminated the one who performed the ritual. The priest or person who prepared the ashes, who mixed the water, or who even just sprinkled the final mixture upon the impure person, instantly became impure himself and had to wash his clothes and body before returning to the camp. It was a strange, reciprocal contamination and purification. The water acted like a spiritual detergent, removing the deep stain of death from the impure, but leaving a temporary, lighter stain of impurity on the pure one who handled it. This mystery defied simple logic. It was a law above reason, confirming that the principles of ritual holiness operated on a plane different from human understanding. It suggested that death itself was such a profound anomaly that the antidote to it required a kind of sacred paradox. purity, achieving its result through temporary impurity. The red heifer ritual, therefore, was not taught as a lesson, but as a deep, mystical truth about the nature of life and death, contamination and cleanliness. It was a singular law, perpetually reserved for dealing with the ultimate disruption, the presence of death. The nature of this water, which cleanses external contamination and the taint of mortality, transitions us naturally to a law that dealt with a form of internal contamination and the potential breach of the most sacred bond within the community, the integrity of marriage. That shift from external, ritual impurity to internal, communal contamination leads us to the bizarre and unsettling procedure of the water of jealousy, or soda. Having explored the inexplicable ritual of the red heifer, which dealt with the physical contamination of death, we now turn to a deeply unsettling legal and spiritual procedure designed to deal with a contamination of the marital bond. The ritual of the water of jealousy, or sota. This law was established for the specific, excruciating scenario where a husband suspected his wife of infidelity, but had no witnesses, no physical proof, and only the corrosive certainty of his own suspicion to rely upon. The husband's suspicion alone was enough to initiate this rare and drastic ritual. The Torah recognized that unchecked jealousy could destroy a marriage and a community, and therefore provided an extraordinary divine mechanism to resolve the matter and bring either irrefutable proof of guilt or absolute clearance of innocence. The accused woman would be brought by her husband to the sanctuary, placed under the charge of the priest. The ritual was designed to be public and deeply humbling. Her hair would be unbound, a symbol of her being stripped of her dignity and presented as an object of shame and suspicion. The priest would then prepare the mysterious drink. The elements of the drink were simple but symbolically potent. The priest would take holy water from a laver, and into it, he would scrape dust from the floor of the sanctuary itself. The dust represented the earth and mortality, the final end of all things, while the holy water represented the purifying power of the divine presence. The priest would also write down the bitter curses, the specific calamities that would befall the woman if she were guilty, onto a scroll. He would then dissolve this scroll into the water, ensuring that the ink and the words of the curse mingled with the dust and water, making the words themselves a physical part of the potion. The climax of the ritual required the woman to stand before the priest and make a solemn oath of innocence. Then, she was commanded to drink the bitter, cursed water. The entire procedure was a profound test of conscience, where only the supernatural intervention of the divine could provide the verdict. The effects of drinking the water were believed to be instantaneous and visible, acting as a direct physical manifestation of the spiritual truth. If the woman was innocent, the water would cause her no harm. She would be instantly cleared of the suspicion, and the marriage could resume with trust restored. The text even suggests that she would be blessed with the ability to conceive, turning the ordeal into a moment of divine vindication. However, if she was guilty, if she had indeed committed the act of adultery, the water was said to cause her abdomen to swell and her thigh to waste away, a painful and visible public confirmation of her sin. This terrible, instantaneous physical reaction served as the ultimate proof of guilt, resulting in her being ostracized from the community. The ritual was not a trial by jury, but a trial by ordeal, administered under the direct authority of the sanctuary. It emphasized that while human justice might fail for lack of witnesses, divine truth would always find a way to manifest itself in the physical world. The deep fear and profound social weight of this public ritual acted as a powerful moral deterrent, ensuring that the sanctity of marriage was held in the highest regard, even in the absence of human oversight. The necessity of this extreme ritual highlights the absolute importance of truth and fidelity in a society where the family unit was the bedrock of the entire structure. This dramatic, highly regulated legal judgment, providing sanctuary for marital truth, leads us away from the anxiety of the legal process and into a physical sanctuary designed to protect life itself. The concept of safe, designated places for those in peril brings us to the unique laws governing the cities of refuge. The intricate ritual of the soda provided a spiritual sanctuary for the truth, allowing the accused to seek refuge in a divine verdict. Now we turn to a law that provided a physical, concrete sanctuary for those whose lives were in peril, yet who were not criminals in the eyes of justice. The establishment of the cities of refuge, or Are Miklat. This was a unique legal and geographical system designed to distinguish sharply between premeditated murder and accidental manslaughter. In the ancient world, justice often relied on the principle of the blood avenger, a relative of the deceased who had the legal and moral obligation to track down and kill the killer, regardless of the circumstances. This system provided closure, but often led to endless retaliatory blood feuds, confusing intention with outcome. The divine law sought to interrupt this cycle of vengeance by creating a buffer zone. 6 designated urban centers were set aside across the land of Israel, 3 on one side of the Jordan River and 3 on the other. These were not prisons or places of perpetual exile. They were sanctuaries established for a single, specific purpose: to provide safe, highly regulated refuge for a person who had accidentally killed another without malice or forethought. The infrastructure surrounding these cities was itself a marvel of ancient legal planning. The roads leading to the cities of refuge were required to be meticulously maintained, wide, and clearly marked, with signs indicating the path to the nearest safe haven. The idea was to eliminate any barrier or delay that might prevent the unintentional killer from reaching safety before the furious blood avenger caught him. Speed and clarity were paramount. Once the accidental killer reached the city gates, he was afforded immediate protection. However, his stay was not unconditional. He was required to stand trial before the elders of the city, where the facts of the case were meticulously reviewed. This trial determined whether the death was truly accidental, a falling stone, an axe head slipping, or whether there was any hidden malice or intent. If the killer was judged to have acted with premeditation, he was immediately handed over to the blood avenger and executed. The city of refuge only protected the accidental. If, however, the elders confirmed that the killing was indeed accidental manslaughter, the person was required to remain within the physical boundaries of that city of refuge for the duration of his sentence. Leaving the city meant forfeiting his protection, and the blood avenger would be justified in killing him. The length of the confinement was defined not by a specific number of years, but by a single, powerful event: the death of the high priest. When the high priest died, the gates of all the cities of refuge were opened, and the involuntary resident was free to return home, his obligation fulfilled. The death of the high priest, who carried the sins of the people and was their great spiritual representative, was viewed as a nationwide act of atonement, wiping the slate clean and allowing the accidental offender to rejoin his community. This unique legal system enforced a profound lesson. While there was no moral guilt for an accidental death, there was still a required consequence and a debt to be paid to the life that was lost. It protected human life, honored justice, and provided a mechanism for ultimate forgiveness and reintegration. The concept of safe, designated places for those in peril, and the legal requirement to maintain the stability of life, naturally leads us to the laws governing what was left behind for the poor. The social justice inherent in the cities of refuge is echoed in the permanent agricultural safety net woven into the harvest calendar. That shift in focus brings us to the rules governing the corner of the field. The cities of refuge offered a legal, centralized, and extraordinary sanctuary for the life of the accidental offender. We now turn to a law that required the creation of a spontaneous, localized, and everyday sanctuary for the life of the poor, the stranger, and the vulnerable, the law of the corner of the field, or PIA. This was a profound system of radical agricultural social security built right into the mandatory rhythm of the harvest. The law of PIA was a simple command to the farmer. When you harvest your field, you are strictly forbidden from harvesting the produce from the corner of that field. The farmer was required to leave that portion standing, ungathered, for the poor, the stranger, and the widow. This was not considered charity, but a divine obligation. The size of the corner was not explicitly defined, leaving it to the conscience and generosity of the farmer, making the law a test of internal moral commitment rather than mere external compliance. The spiritual power of this law lay in the principle of intentional incompletion. The farmer, who had spent months toiling, nurturing, and protecting his crop, was commanded at the height of his effort to stop short, to voluntarily relinquish his claim on the fullest yield. He had to stand back and watch the remaining corner of the field become communal property. It was an exercise in self-restraint and a recognition that the abundance he enjoyed was not solely his own, but a blessing to be shared. Furthermore, the law of PIA was twinned with two similar laws of intentional omission. The first was the law of the forgotten sheaf. If a farmer or a worker forgot a sheaf of grain in the field after finishing the main harvest, he was strictly forbidden from returning to retrieve it. That forgotten sheaf was instantly declared the property of the poor, a secondary chance for those in need to find sustenance. The second was the command not to gather the grapes that fell to the ground during the harvest, nor to go back for a second pass to pick every last cluster from the vine. The gleanings, the fallen grapes and the forgotten clusters, were likewise to be left for the needy. These three laws, pia, the forgotten sheaf, and gleanings, combine to form a magnificent, decentralized social safety net. It guaranteed a continuous, dignified source of food for those who were most vulnerable. Critically, it required the poor to actively participate in the gathering. They had to go to the fields themselves and glean the remnants. This structure preserved the dignity of the recipients, as they were not begging for alms, but simply exercising a divinely mandated right to access the residual abundance of the land. The laws turned the entire agricultural landscape into a running expression of communal responsibility. The farmer was commanded to practice humility and self-limitation, while the poor were guaranteed provision directly from the source. The act of leaving Pia ensured that the altar, moment of greatest individual prosperity, the harvest, was simultaneously the moment of greatest social sharing. The focus on what was left behind for the poor and the miracle of sustenance provided directly from the ground without human effort transitions us to a food source that appeared and disappeared without any human cultivation, a pure, supernatural provision that sustained the nation in the desert. That transition from the meticulously cultivated field to the wild, mysterious desert food brings us to the law concerning the manna. The law of the corner of the field, pia, required humanity to exercise self-restraint and trust that the cultivated ground would yield enough abundance for both the farmer and the poor. Our focus now shifts entirely from the painstakingly cultivated field to the wild, barren desert, and to a food source that appeared and disappeared without any human effort, a pure, supernatural provision that sustained the nation for 40 years. The manna. The story of the manna is one of the most astonishing miracles in the entire narrative, serving as a 4-decade-long lesson in absolute daily dependence and the power of routine. The Israelites had fled Egypt, leaving behind the known supply chains of civilization, and found themselves starving in a desolate landscape where no crops could grow. It was here, at the lowest point of their material despair, that the food began to appear. The manna was described as a fine, flake-like substance like frost on the ground, or like coriander seed, white and tasting like wafers made with honey. It was entirely mysterious. The name manna itself comes from the Hebrew question manhu, meaning, what is it? They did not know its origin, its nature, or its composition, yet it was the sole source of their sustenance for 40 years. It was a tangible, edible link between the heavens and the earth, reminding them daily that their lives were sustained by a power beyond their own labor. The mystery of the manna was compounded by the strict, strange rules that governed its collection. They were commanded to gather only an omer, a specific, measured portion, for each person in their tent, and only what was needed for that single day. This rule was a relentless test of their faith and their ability to follow routine. If someone tried to hoard the manna, gathering more than their allotted omer, the surplus would breed worms and spoil overnight. This ensured that there was no such thing as savings, security, or excess. Every person, from the leader to the lowliest individual, had to wake up every morning and rely completely on the renewed provision. It leveled the community and dissolved the concept of material wealth. The rich man could not buy more. and the poor man could not receive less. This routine, however, was broken on the sixth day of the week, in preparation for the Sabbath. On the sixth day, they were commanded to gather a double portion, 2 omers per person. When they collected this double amount, it did not spoil. The manna gathered on the sixth day remained fresh and edible throughout the Sabbath. Crucially, the law forbade any manna from appearing on the Sabbath itself. This rule was the centerpiece of the entire structure. It commanded absolute cessation of work on the Sabbath, enforcing the principle that the seventh day was a day of rest, consecrated not by human effort, but by divine trust. The entire economy of the desert was calibrated to teach the meaning of the Sabbath. The gathering of the yoka, manna, was not easy. The flakes appeared only after the dew evaporated, meaning the people had to rise early and collect the small, ephemeral substance before the desert sun melted it away. This required diligence, but within the confines of the established rule. It was a routine of scarcity and miraculous abundance, a food that simultaneously fostered humility and gratitude. The consumption of this ephemeral food, which appeared and disappeared with the dew and could not be hoarded, taught the Israelites the profound spiritual lesson of living one day at a time, trusting completely in the provision of the next sunrise. This contrasts sharply with the deep, lasting sorrow that marked the disruption of life's most fundamental bond: the loss of a loved one. The lightness of the manna contrasts with the heavy, ritualized destruction that marked grief, leading us away from this temporary desert food to the permanent, physical customs of mourning. The ephemeral manna taught the nation a 40-year lesson in daily provision and trust, a profound lightness of being dependent on the next sunrise. Now, we turn to the stark, immediate, and unavoidable response to the loss of that provision, the loss of life itself, by exploring the ancient, mandatory rituals of grief. Kariah, the tearing of one's garments, and the custom of sitting in dust and ashes. These acts were not merely emotional outbursts. They were required, public, and physical declarations of utter devastation, marking a sudden and violent separation from the world's conventions. The central ritual of immediate grief was Kariah, the tearing of one's garments. This was a mandatory act performed upon hearing news of the death of a close relative, a parent, child, sibling, or spouse. The tear was not a symbolic rent or a slight fray. It was a deliberate, irreversible tear in the outer garment, often starting near the heart. The act symbolized the tearing of the heart itself, a visible and violent manifestation that the fabric of the mourner's life had been irrevocably rent and broken by the loss. It was an instant, external expression of internal trauma. The required tear was highly specific and regulated, transforming what might seem like a spontaneous act into a ritual of compliance. It had to be done standing up, acknowledging the full, present reality of the loss. And it had to be a tear through the outer layer of clothing, clearly visible to all observers. The tear's location and extent depended on the relationship to the deceased. For most relatives, the tear was made on the left side over the heart, symbolizing the rupture of the relationship held close to the core. For the death of a parent, however, the tear was often made on the right side and extended further down the garment, signifying the uniquely deep, foundational, and permanent nature of that loss. The tear had to be large enough to be clearly visible, rendering the garment permanently defiled for fine use. This meant the mourner could not simply change clothes and move on. They were mandated to wear the visible sign of their brokenness for the entire initial period of mourning. It was a public sign that the person was actively engaged in deep mourning and therefore temporarily separated from the normal conventions and niceties of society. They were, for a time, outside the usual social contract. This act of destruction was ritually irreversible. The torn garment could be stitched up loosely later on, once the most intense period of mourning had passed, but it was never to be completely repaired. It forever bore the scar of the loss, a constant physical reminder woven into the individual's wardrobe. The law acknowledged that some losses were so profound they could never truly be mended. The spiritual law made an exception for the consecrated. The ordinary priest, consecrated to high ritual purity, was strictly forbidden from performing kariah for anyone except his closest relatives, and the high priest was absolutely forbidden from tearing his garments at all, highlighting the supreme importance of his office over the natural impulse of grief. For the common Israelite, however, the tear was essential, an act of ritual compliance that channeled the initial shock of loss into a prescribed physical action. Following the tearing of the clothes, the grief continued with the ritual of sitting in dust and ashes. Mourners would often cover their heads with dust or ashes, or simply sit directly on the ground, rejecting the comfort of furniture. This deliberate adoption of the lowest, most desolate state was an acknowledgement of human fragility and mortality. Dust was the substance from which humanity was created, and to return to the dust, even symbolically, was to join the deceased in the lowest possible state, expressing profound solidarity with the ultimate end of all flesh. It was a powerful physical rejection of worldly comfort, status, and vanity. The spiritual significance of this public, physical display of devastation was profound. It was an enforced vulnerability, declaring to the community that the individual was broken, unavailable for social pleasantries, and in need of compassionate forbearance. This public expression ensured that grief was a communal experience. No one was allowed to suffer their loss in total isolation. The visible tear and the dust-covered head served as a powerful reminder to others that death was a profound reality, and that life was a temporary arrangement held in delicate balance. The physical disruption of the garment mirrored the spiritual disruption of the soul, providing a necessary outlet for the initial, violent pain of separation. The extreme nature of this public, physical grief, the tearing of the clothes, and the covering with dust, naturally transitions to the more quiet, personal, yet compulsory customs that followed the initial shock and the burial. The immediate devastation gives way to a 7-day period of stillness and reflection, a necessary pause mandated by the law to process the profound disruption of death in a sheltered environment. Following the intensity of the burial and the dramatic required act of kariah, the tearing of the garments, the focus of grief transitioned to a period of quiet, internal, and highly regulated reflection known as Shiva. This was a 7-day period of compulsory mourning observed immediately after the burial of the deceased, a week-long, divinely mandated pause from the normal, unrelenting motion of life. It was a time when the external world was shut out so that the internal work of sorrow could begin without interruption. The term Shiva literally means seven, referring to the 7 full days during which the mourners, the immediate family, were commanded to cease almost all normal activities and sit quietly at home. The custom was rooted in deep biblical history, acknowledging that the human psyche required a structured, extended period to absorb the reality of loss, rather than rushing back into the distractions of work, commerce, and social engagement. The very act of enforcing this rest recognized that grief was itself an exhausting form of labor, demanding total physical and mental concentration. During Shiva, the mourners would sit on low stools or cushions, often maintaining the same humble posture of self-abasement that followed the initial shock of the death. They were forbidden from engaging in work, commerce, bathing for pleasure, cutting their hair, wearing leather shoes, or studying the joyous passages of the Torah. They were, by spiritual decree, removed from the world of the active living and placed in a state of suspended animation, where their only required occupation was the contemplation of their loss. Even the mirrors in the home were often covered, ensuring that the focus remained external, on the lost loved one, rather than internal, on one's own appearance or vanity. Crucially, the external world was commanded to come to the mourners. Visitors came to the home, not primarily to offer counsel or even copious words of comfort, but to simply be present. The greatest virtue of a visitor during the first few days was often considered to be silence. The custom dictated that the mourners were not expected to speak first or to host their guests. They initiated conversation only if they desired it, and their words were to be answered softly and gently. The visitor's presence was meant to be a quiet, reflective, and non-judgmental form of support, acknowledging the profound suffering without attempting to fill the agonizing silence with meaningless chatter. The silence itself became a deep, restorative language, communicating solidarity and respect for the immensity of the loss and the exhaustion it inflicted. We contrast the loud, theatrical nature of tearing clothes, which was the burst of initial devastation, with the quiet, reflective, and compulsory nature of this week-long pause. Karaya was about rupture and release. Shiva was about rest and containment. The tear allowed the initial pain to escape violently, while the 7 days of silence provided a sheltered, time-bound space for the wound to begin its long, slow process of integration. The strict regulation of the mourning period ensured that the physical needs of the grieving were met and that the community understood its role as a supportive presence, rather than an agent of unwelcome distraction. Meals were prepared by neighbors and brought to the house, and the daily rhythm of communal prayer was often brought into the home of the mourner, ensuring that the necessary religious duties were maintained without demanding that the mourner leave their sanctuary of sorrow. This collective care prevented the mourner from being overwhelmed by the basic demands of survival. The 7 days of Shiva were followed by a further period of reduced mourning, lasting 30 days, and then, for the loss of a parent, a full year. Each subsequent period, gradually and gently, introduced the mourner back into the routines of society, creating a required staircase of return that respected the slow, non-linear process of adjustment. The mandated cessation of activity for a week. This required pause from the labor and movement of the world brings us to the final, permanent cessation of movement that defined the nation's spiritual center. The focus shifts from the temporary sanctuary of the mourning home to the permanent architectural sanctuary designed for the ultimate cessation of human noise and the reception of divine presence. That shift leads us to the structure and symbolism of the tabernacle. The structured silence of Shiva provided a temporary, necessary rest from the world. Our journey now concludes by turning our focus to the ultimate structure of rest, the architectural sanctuary that traveled with the Israelites through the wilderness, the tabernacle, or Mishkan. This was not a fixed temple, but a portable, tent-like holy enclosure, the earthly dwelling place for the divine presence among the nation, and the physical focal point of their entire spiritual and communal life for 40 years. The description of the tabernacle is measured, precise, and profoundly symbolic, turning the physical structure into a meticulous map of the spiritual cosmos. Its design was not left to human creativity or aesthetic preference. Every measurement, every material, and every color was given by explicit divine command, ensuring its perfect ritual compliance and its function as a meeting place between the heavens and the earth. The outermost area was the courtyard, a large rectangular space surrounded by tall white linen curtains held up by silver-topped pillars. This white linen barrier separated the sacred area from the profane dust of the surrounding camp. Here, within the courtyard, stood the massive bronze altar, the center of all sacrificial offerings and the public focus of national atonement. The sheer size of the altar, constantly aflame, emphasized that the first and most continuous interaction with the divine was through the demanding process of sacrifice, confession, and purification. Near the altar stood the bronze laver, a large basin filled with water for the priests to wash their hands and feet, symbolizing the prerequisite of cleanliness before performing sacred service. Beyond the courtyard stood the actual tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, divided into two distinct, increasingly holy chambers. The exterior of the tent was covered by layers of rough hides, dyed ram skins and tough sea cow skins, making it appear humble, protected from the elements, and blending into the desert landscape. But the interior was a breathtaking display of spiritual wealth and ritual intent. The first larger room was the holy place. Its walls were constructed of massive acacia wood frames overlaid entirely with pure gold, making the entire room shimmer with a soft, reflected, warm light. Inside this chamber were three key pieces of furniture, each representing a facet of spiritual devotion and responsibility. On one side stood the seven-branched menorah, made of one piece of pure hammered gold. It was a source of light that did not rely on the sun, its olive oil flames burning perpetually, symbolizing the light of divine knowledge, spiritual illumination, and the perpetual presence of the Holy Spirit. Opposite the menorah was the table of showbread, also made of gold-covered wood, where 12 fresh loaves of bread were placed weekly, symbolizing the sustained provision for the 12 tribes of Israel and the perpetual covenant of sustenance. And finally, near the veil, stood the small, square altar of incense, made of gold. On this altar, fragrant incense was burned daily in the morning and evening. The smoke, rising in a continuous column, symbolized the prayers and spiritual desires of the people ascending to the heavens. The holy place was separated from the final, innermost chamber by a thick, elaborate curtain or veil, known as the parochet. This massive screen was woven with blue, purple, and scarlet threads, and embroidered with intricate figures of cherubim, symbolizing the final, profound boundary between the earthly realm of the priests and the celestial dwelling of the divine. Behind this veil was the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the most sacred spot on earth. This room was a perfect cube, plated entirely in gold, representing perfect spiritual dimensions, and it contained only one object, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a gold-covered wooden chest containing the most sacred relics, the tablets of the law, a jar of manna preserved from the desert, and Aaron's rod that miraculously budded. Above the ark rested the caperet, or mercy seat, a solid gold slab with two intricately hammered golden cherubim facing each other, their massive wings outstretched to cover the space. This was the quiet, empty holiness of the Holy of Holies. No light from the sun or the menorah penetrated this space. It was lit only by the imagined, uncreated glory of the divine presence itself, which rested symbolically above the mercy seat, between the wings of the cherubim. The high priest was permitted to enter this room only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, reinforcing the immense, terrifying separation between the human and the ultimate divine reality. The entire structure, from the humble linen of the courtyard to the pure gold of the inner cube, was designed as a descending staircase of sanctity, moving inward from the dust of the camp to the purity of the inner chamber. It served as a constant, measured anchor for the entire community, confirming that even in the chaotic, wandering wilderness, there was a defined, ordered space where the divine presence could be met. This quiet, measured, architecturally calming conclusion brings the journey to a restful close, leaving us with the image of gold shining in the dark and the empty perfection of the Holy of Holies.